Before we begin the video, if you've been getting value out of this channel, please consider supporting High Americana via Patreon, linked in the description. At $3,000 a month, you will help me make this a full-time job and can also request historical content to be made. Thank you. And now, a passage from The Virgin Islands, Our New Possessions, and the British Islands by Theodoor de Booy and John T. Faris, from Chapter 1, From Denmark to the United States. A writer in the Review of Reviews, referring to the disappointing failure of 1867, said, "If we had purchased the islands at that time, our influence in the West Indies would have grown in such a way that it is reasonable to believe that we could subsequently have purchased Cuba from Spain, and thus averted 2 or 3 wars and much misery." Not until after the Spanish-American War was the purchase of these islands again seriously considered. Once more, the United States had felt the need of a naval station in the Caribbean. Consequently, another treaty was negotiated in January 1902. Owing to the efforts of President Roosevelt and Secretary of State John Hay, this treaty was promptly ratified by the United States Senate. The Folketing, lower house, of Denmark readily gave its consent to the proposed sale of the islands for $5 million, but the upper house of the Danish Parliament failed to vote in favor of confirmation. It has generally been thought that German influence was responsible for the failure to sanction this treaty. Possibly the German government itself hoped, at some time or other, to obtain a foothold in the West Indies. While there were, in 1911 and 1912, attempts to renew interest in the purchase, nothing came of these. Not until the latter part of 1916 was another determined effort made to induce the Danes to cede the islands. For the 3 principal islands and their outlying keys, $25 million was offered. A popular vote of the Danish people was taken in December to see if it was their wish to give up Denmark's only tropical colony. As the cost of governing these islands had become far greater than the revenues derived from them, and as the Danes were forced to admit that the inhabitants of the Dutch West Indies were themselves greatly in favor of the transfer, 283,000 voted for the ratification of the treaty, while 157,000 were opposed to the sale. This favorable vote was hailed with great joy in St. Thomas and St. Croix. The islands finally came into the possession of the United States on January 17, 1917, when Secretary of State Lansing and Minister Brun of Denmark signed the ratification of the Treaty of Cession. In this ratification, it was stipulated that the islands would be taken over within 90 days. The final act was staged on March 31, 1917, when the Dannebrog, the official name of the Danish flag, was replaced by the Stars and Stripes. It was the original intention that this change of flags should take place with great ceremony, but the exigencies of the international situation and the fact that the break of the United States with Germany had just taken place made a popular demonstration inadvisable, and the plans made by the Assistant Secretary of the Navy to assist in the celebration with part of the United States Atlantic Squadron were cancelled. But in spite of the comparative lack of ceremony, the lowering of the Dannebrog and the hoisting in its stead of the Stars and Stripes was an impressive event. An event which every thinking American should regard with pride. Once again, the adherents of the Monroe Doctrine rejoiced in the acquisition of additional territory needed to promote the peace of the world, and one more European nationality ceased to be represented in the complex political scheme of the Antilles. While the transfer of the islands was not viewed with universal joy by their inhabitants, it can be said safely that fully 90% of the natives were only too glad to be adopted by the American government. They were not dissatisfied by the treatment that had been accorded them under Danish rule, for the government by the Danish officials had been benevolent and paternal. But Denmark was far away, and especially in the last 3 years when regular communication with Europe was hard to maintain, a long time was required to consult the home government on matters of importance and to bring about necessary improvements in local affairs. They felt that under the rule of the United States any public business could be attended to speedily. Furthermore, practically all the commerce of St. Thomas was with the United States, and the imports from the mother country were but a negligible item. The St. Thomians were more used to American customs and manners than they were to those of Denmark, owing to the frequent visits of American ships to the shores of the island. In St. Croix, also, it was felt that adoption by the United States would give a new impetus to the sugar industry, that there would be a new development of all her latent resources, and that there would be an outlet to Puerto Rico for her surplus production. It was, of course, a sad thing for the Danish government to view the lowering of the Dannebrog, which, with but 2 short intervals in the 19th century, had proudly waved for 2½ centuries over the little group of islands. Yet it was the wish of Denmark not to stand in the way of the prosperity of its colonial dependents. While there will undoubtedly be a few who will regard with disfavor the innovations that will be introduced by the United States, the majority will be grateful that the uncertainty which began in 1866 and lasted until 1917 is now ended for all time. It was left to the present inhabitants of the islands to decide whether or not they wished to become citizens of the United States. Those who, within 1 year of the date of transfer, should signify their desire to do so, would remain subjects of the Danish king. All others would automatically become citizens of the United States, having all the rights and privileges of this status. According to the National Geographic Society of Washington, the total area of the 3 principal islands acquired by the United States is 132.47 square miles. With the keys and rocks that form part of the group, the area might possibly be as much as 150 square miles. The population has been variously stated as being from 30,000 to 33,000, of whom about 10% are white. A study of earlier statistics shows that the population has decreased greatly during the century. In 1828, there were 46,000 inhabitants, but by 1841 this total had dropped to 41,000. Because of their situation, the islands are the logical distributing center for goods destined for the Lesser Antilles, and they have long been a shipping point of some importance. In the days before the European War, a number of intercolonial steamers called at the ports of St. Thomas and St. Croix and connected the towns of these islands not only with the Leeward Islands, but also with Puerto Rico, Santo Domingo, Haiti, Cuba, and Jamaica. That this value of the islands as a shipping center was well realized when their purchase was considered is shown by the report of Secretary of State Lansing, transmitted to Congress on January 22, 1917. In this report he said, "The commercial value of the islands cannot be doubted. Lying in close proximity to many of the passages into the Caribbean Sea, the use of St. Thomas Harbor as a stopping station for merchant ships plying between the United States and South America and for vessels in other trades is of great importance. Though the United States took over the islands at a cost of about $300 per acre, there is no doubt that from all points of view their value is incalculable. It is more than probable that the revenues derived from them will suffice to pay the cost of their government, and none of these revenues are to be expended upon matters not directly related to the local government. The act providing for the temporary government specifically states that debts and taxes collected on the Virgin Islands of the United States shall not be placed in the Treasury of the United States, but shall be used and expended for the government and benefit of the islands. The government of the islands will not be expensive. The form has already been fixed. In the language of an act to provide temporary government for the West Indian Islands acquired by the United States from Denmark, all military, civil, and judicial powers shall be vested in a governor, and in such person or persons as the President may appoint, and shall be exercised in such manner as the President shall direct until Congress shall provide for the government of said islands. The governor, who may be an officer of the Army or Navy, is appointed by the President, subject to senatorial confirmation. The first governor appointed was an officer of the Navy, Rear Admiral James H. Oliver. Election laws and local laws are to remain in effect, and are to be administered by the local tribunals. Judicial tribunals have their jurisdiction extended to cases in which the United States or a citizen is a party. Under the new customs regulations, no duty is charged on articles coming into the United States from the islands, providing they are native products or do not contain more than 20% of foreign materials. All other articles pay the same duty as imports from foreign countries. Sugar pays an export duty of $8 per ton, regardless of its ultimate destination. The elimination of the Danish nation as a power in the Antilles left the flags of but 3 European nations in the Caribbean, those of Great Britain, of France, and of the Netherlands. It is not inconceivable that Great Britain, at some future time, may be induced to cede to the United States some of her islands in the Caribbean. The Bahamas, for instance, are today in very much the same position as were the Danish islands during the 20 years before the transfer. They depend upon the United States for the majority of their imports and for a market for their exports. The tourist resort of Nassau on the island of New Providence is visited almost exclusively by Americans and would lose its only claim to importance if the revenue from this source were cut off. This condition is well appreciated by the Bahamians themselves. They would, in all probability, welcome adoption by the United States, for their fruits would find a duty-free market, and thus the one agricultural possibility of the islands would be given an encouraging impetus. Jamaica, while having more intercourse with Great Britain, practically depends upon the United States for the sale of her entire banana crop. Where one steamer communicates with England, 10 seek the nearer ports of the North American continent. It must be understood, however, that the sale of any of the British West Indies is but a remote possibility, although within the bounds of probability. A far more probable purchase would be that of the Dutch islands of the West Indies. The possessions of the Netherlands in the Caribbean are a loss to the government and a menace to the mother country. In the event of war between the United States and one of the larger European nations, the first hostile act on the part of the latter might well prove to be the violation of Dutch neutrality by the seizure of the island of Curaçao, which possesses an excellent naval station and a well-protected harbor. Such seizure would be a serious menace to the safety of the Panama Canal, and there might be far-reaching consequences. If, on the other hand, the United States had Curaçao in its possession, the approach to the Panama Canal by way of the southern channels of the Lesser Antilles would be safeguarded. This also applies to the Dutch islands of St. Martin, Saba, and St. Eustatius in the northern group of the Leeward Islands. Should these come under the United States flag, the entire range of islands from the Florida coast to the mainland of South America would be dominated by the American Navy. A glance at the map of the Caribbean will reveal the truth of this statement. The Guantanamo naval base on the southern coast of the eastern part of Cuba can control not only the Florida Straits between Florida and Cuba, but also the windward passage between Cuba and Haiti. A fleet stationed at Culebra Island and at St. Thomas could give battle to any squadron that should try to force its way through the Mona Passage between Santo Domingo and Puerto Rico, or through the Virgin Passage separating Puerto Rico from the Virgin Islands. This same fleet would also be in a position to protect the passages due east from the island of St. John. From the island of Barbuda to the island of Trinidad, however, can be found some 12 deep water channels, which, in the event of war with a maritime nation, would require a patrol fleet of almost prohibitive size to give warning of the approach of a hostile fleet. If, therefore, the United States can prevail upon the Dutch government to sell her West Indian possessions, not only would the sale be to the advantage of Holland, since it would relieve her of her unproductive colonies in the Caribbean, and would remove the menace of having these colonies seized by a European nation, but also the strategic importance of the naval station to be established by the United States on the former Danish West Indies would be materially increased. A chain of defenses could thus be thrown around the Panama Canal that would afford complete protection from all the Atlantic approaches.